Welcome. You're watching Last Records. Today, I'll be going over the worst Karens who ended up meeting their doom because of their own karma. From a Karen who climbed out her apartment window to steal air conditioning, to another who laughed at a lifeguard trying to save her, unaware things were about to end brutally. It was December 11th, 2018, a luxury hilltop resort outside Asheville, North Carolina. Nearly 300 guests had gathered for an extravagant winter wedding. The reception hall overlooked rain-covered mountain scenery through towering glass walls. Priya Malhotra was 52 years old and lived in Mumbai, India. She owned a chain of upscale restaurants and boutique hotels across Western India. She was accustomed to being treated with what she called proper respect and made sure everyone around her understood that. Through long-standing business connections with the bride's parents, she had quietly contributed a massive amount of money toward the wedding months earlier. The bride had never been told. Her parents assumed it would never become an issue. It became one before dinner was finished. Priya arrived acting less like a guest and more like the owner of the entire event. She interrupted venue staff, demanded seating adjustments moments before the ceremony began, criticized floral arrangements in front of decorators, and insisted photographers prioritize her over close relatives. Throughout the evening, she reminded anyone nearby that none of this would exist without her. She snapped at servers, argued with musicians over song choices, and kept demanding champagne long after bartenders tried cutting her off. At one point, she complained openly that the bride spent too much time thanking people who had contributed nothing. Shortly after 11 p.m., the bride gave an emotional speech thanking family members, childhood friends, and the people who helped organize the wedding. Priya sat holding her champagne glass and smiling. She was certain her name was coming. The speech ended without mentioning her once. I want to be fair. She contributed a significant amount of money, but she did it secretly and then expected a public reward. That is not generosity. That is a transaction she never disclosed. She stood up immediately and began criticizing the bride in front of the entire room. She shouted that she had paid for half the wedding and demanded people acknowledge her. Relatives and staff tried calming her down. The bride stood at the microphone, visibly shaken, hearing for the first time exactly how much had been contributed behind her back. Nothing calmed Priya down. She was already past that point. Very furious and struggling to keep her balance in a narrow designer heels, she stormed out of the reception hall into the cold, wet night, carrying a nearly full champagne glass. Guests followed, urging her to slow down. She ignored them and kept moving down the rain-soaked marble staircase toward the valet entrance while yelling back toward the doors. Halfway down, her heel caught the wet marble. She fell backward. The back of her head struck the sharp stone edge of a step before her body came to rest several steps below. The champagne glass shattered beside her. Paramedics found her unconscious with severe head trauma and heavy bleeding. She was transported to a nearby trauma hospital in critical condition. Doctors confirmed a catastrophic skull fracture and massive traumatic brain injury. Despite emergency surgery, Priya was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. The reception continued quietly at the request of both families. The atmosphere was already gone.
It was December 3rd, 2017. The apartment complex in suburban Colorado sat on a hillside overlooking a parking lot and landscaped courtyard. Evening temperatures had dropped to the low 30s. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, but had melted on the balconies, exposed to the afternoon sun. The third-floor unit hosted a small gathering for a friend's promotion celebration. Mina Frost was 34 years old, a marketing consultant known for her demanding personality and need to be the center of attention. She had arrived fashionably late, immediately complaining about the cold and asking why they couldn't have met somewhere warmer. She wore an expensive sweater and designer jeans, constantly adjusting her outfit for photos. Within minutes of arriving, she was already critiquing the apartment's decor and suggesting how the party could have been better organized. The balcony extended roughly 8 feet from the sliding glass door, enclosed by a metal railing painted dark green. Earlier in the evening, another guest had noticed the railing flex slightly when someone leaned against it and mentioned it to the group. Several people decided to stay inside after hearing this, but Mina overheard the conversation and immediately scoffed. She dismissed the concern with a dramatic wave of her hand, calling everyone paranoid and overly dramatic. She insisted the railing was perfectly fine and that people were being ridiculous. She wanted the perfect Instagram shot with the courtyard view in the background, and nothing was going to stop her from getting it. When her friend suggested taking photos inside instead, Mina rolled her eyes and declared that she knew what she was doing. Mina stepped onto the balcony despite multiple warnings, positioning herself for photos. She demanded that others come out to take multiple shots from different angles, becoming increasingly irritated when people hesitated. When someone again mentioned the railing concern, she snapped that she wasn't going to let paranoid people ruin her photos. She had paid good money for this outfit and wasn't about to waste it on boring indoor shots. She began posing against the railing, completely ignoring the slight movement others had warned about. When a guest suggested she step away from the edge, Mina became hostile, telling them to mind their own business. She leaned backward against the railing, insisting this was the best angle and that she knew how to pose better than anyone there. The metal gave slightly, but Mina ignored it, focused entirely on getting her perfect shot. She adjusted her position, placing both hands on the top rail behind her, putting her full weight against the structure while demanding more photos. Even as the railing creaked ominously, she refused to move, calling the sounds normal. The corroded anchor bolts, weakened by years of moisture and freeze-thaw cycles, began shearing sequentially under the sustained pressure. The first bolt failed, then the second, causing the railing section to tilt suddenly outward. Mina felt the movement but was too committed to her pose. The remaining bolts gave way and the railing section detached completely. Mina fell with it, dropping 22 feet to the concrete walkway below. She struck the concrete torso first, the impact compressing her chest cavity. Milliseconds later, her head made contact with the walkway, resulting in severe cranial trauma. The combined injuries were immediately fatal. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but could only confirm what witnesses already knew. The subsequent building inspection revealed the anchor bolts had been corroded for years, with routine maintenance neglected. Multiple guests reported having warned Mina about the railing's instability.
It was May 27, 2015, in New Braunfels, Texas. Low crossings were running fast and brown after 2 days of heavy rain, with floodwater cutting across normally familiar rural terrain. Stella Roderick was 52 years old, a substitute teacher in a local school district. She was known for being practical, self-reliant, and resistant to caution she viewed as exaggerated, shaped by years of living on rural property and navigating seasonal flooding without incident. Her confidence in reading water conditions was based on past experience rather than updated safety knowledge. And over time, that experience had hardened into certainty about risk. She believed she could visually judge. She was heading home after helping a neighbor move livestock when she came up on a road closure, barricades, warning signs, and a couple of utility workers standing near a flooded stretch of road. That's the first warning sign to go back. They told her there was a downed power line in the water and that it still wasn't safe to go through. The water didn't look that deep, but it was dangerous because of the electricity in it. Even after they warned her a few times, she went around the barrier anyway and walked into the flooded area toward where the line was. And that is just unsettling. Everything's clearly set up and warned, but she still treats it like it doesn't really apply to her.
Unbeknownst to her, the downed line was already energizing the floodwater, creating an uneven electrical field that dispersed through the water and the surrounding ground.
As she moved forward, she repeatedly bridged points of differing voltage, exposing herself to an increasing step potential risk. By the time she went farther into the flooded section, the electrical difference in the water around her had built up enough to become lethal. On her next step, her legs essentially completed a path for the current through her body, and the shock hit almost instantly through her lower body and chest. Her heart likely went into ventricular fibrillation within seconds, cutting off normal function immediately. She dropped straight into the floodwater without any real struggle or sound. I didn't expect it to be that immediate one step, and it's already over. Rescue attempts began almost immediately from outside the energizer de-energized zone. Utility personnel were unable to enter the water due to live current risk and initiated coordination for circuit isolation while attempting to reach her with tools and lines, but distance and conditions prevented contact. Power was eventually isolated at the substation within several minutes, followed by field verification of de-energization before responders entered and retrieved her. She had already been submerged for an extended period, with no cardiac activity upon recovery. CPR was initiated and continued through transport, but she did not regain vital signs.
A medical examination determined death by electrocution due to contact with energized floodwater.
External injuries were minimal, with small electrical burn patterns consistent with electrical contact, though entry and exit points were not definitively localized due to immersion conditions. Internally, her heart showed no prior disease, and death was attributed entirely to electrical disruption of cardiac rhythm. The report noted that the hazard was not visually detectable and that standard warnings and barriers were present at the site. Her belongings were later returned to the family. A handwritten note found during the estate clearing referenced a prior flood season and a reminder to check water levels before crossing the road. It was kept by her daughter. A procedural update was later introduced by the utility company requiring documentation when civilians refused safety instructions at active electrical hazard scenes. No public statement was issued regarding the specific incident that led to the change. It was June 14, 2017, in Barcelona, Spain. The afternoon inside a maritime heritage archive unfolded under controlled lighting with steady visitor flow and normal operations. The visitor was a 38-year-old American woman named Lauren Mitchell, traveling through Europe on a structured cultural tour tied to an educational program and a commercial photography sponsorship. She frequently documented travel experiences for online audiences and was vocal about getting the shot she paid for, often treating group pacing and staff instructions as flexible rather than fixed. The archive had ship components hanging above a reinforced floor, with maintenance channels hidden underneath some sections. Honestly, I'd probably be looking up the whole time in a place like that. Some of those old ship pieces are huge. Visitors were required to stay on the marked walkways, and staff would warn that leaning over the edges or stepping off the path could actually put them near restricted structural areas. As the group entered the main hall, Lauren moved ahead of others and continued filming despite requests to remain within the designated group line. When staff reminded her that a scheduled maintenance window was affecting adjacent operational zones, she dismissed the warning, saying she needed uninterrupted footage for sponsored documentation and that delays would compromise her recording. She barely acknowledged it, treating the warning like another inconvenience standing between her and the shot she wanted. Her movement repeatedly drifted toward walkway edges as she prioritized low-angle shots of the suspended exhibits. Staff attempted further redirection to keep her within the central path, but she only briefly complied before returning forward once attention shifted. Over time, her position began overlapping areas flagged for temporary coordination with the connected dockside maintenance system beneath the structure. By most visitors, lower service levels were conducting scheduled maintenance in adjacent subfloor corridors. A recently serviced section near the exhibit edge was still undergoing final checks, with temporary barriers being repositioned as staff managed visitor flow. Fixed lighting and floor markings indicated the primary route, and staff continued directing visitors away from transitional areas. Lauren stepped into a gap in crowd movement and positioned herself near a transitional floor zone bordering a recently serviced area. While adjusting her camera for a low-angle shot, she moved beyond the marked walkway and into the restricted section before staff could redirect her. The access panel had recently been reinstalled after inspection work and remained under temporary locking hardware while final verification checks were being completed. As she stepped onto the panel from outside the designated load-bearing path, the unsecured section shifted beneath her, opening a gap into the maintenance space below. The impact caused catastrophic blunt force trauma, including suspected head and torso injuries with rapid neurological compromise. Responders found her unconscious and in critical condition, and despite immediate transport and resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to severe internal injuries and traumatic hemorrhage. Investigators confirmed all systems functioned as designed, including walkway supports and monitoring equipment. The maintenance channel was not intended for public access, and its cover panel was rated only for static distributed load, not transitional pressure during synchronized operational activity. The investigation identified multiple contributing factors, including unauthorized entry into a restricted transition area containing a recently serviced access panel and repeated disregard of staff advisories, with photography activity noted as a distraction that reduced situational awareness. No single mechanical fault was identified as the sole cause of the incident. No personal footage was released or circulated, and internal recordings remained restricted, with officials confirming that no verified visual documentation exists publicly. Following the review, coordination protocols and floor edge indicators were strengthened to better separate visitor pathways from active maintenance zones. I thought I was still within the boundaries that mattered. It was February 18th, 2016, and morning sunlight hit the surface of a glacial river in Chile's Lake District, where it cut through a steep-walled gorge lined with mossy rock and overhanging southern beech trees, the water running a milky blue-green from snowmelt and moving fast enough to hear from the put-in point above. Gemma Thornycroft was 29 years old and worked as a PR coordinator for a mid-sized firm in Bristol, England. She was several months into a long trip through South America with a friend, and the rafting was a last-minute addition booked the night before at a hostel. Her friend later said Gemma pretty much treated safety demonstrations the way most people treat terms and conditions on an app, something to sit through so the actual experience could start. During the pre-launch safety briefing, the guide spent about 10 minutes going through what to do if you fall out of the raft, keep your feet downstream, arms crossed over your chest. Do not try to stand up in the current because your foot can get trapped between rocks underwater. Gemma appeared distracted through most of it, checking her phone a couple times and barely looking at the guide. At one point, she leaned over to her friend and said something that made her friend laugh, and the guide noticed and paused and asked her directly if she had any questions. She told him she was good. 10 minutes of briefing and one body position is all that separated her from walking away from that river, and she couldn't be bothered to look up long enough to hear it? That's what I can't get past. The group launched on a section of river rated Class 3 to Class 4. The first two sets of rapids went fine, and Gemma honestly seemed like she was having a good time from what everyone said. A larger hydraulic feature at the base of a drop caught the front of the raft and kicked the bow upward sharply. Gemma was seated in the front left position, the most exposed seat on the raft, and was thrown forward and out. She entered the water headfirst and surfaced roughly 10 feet downstream. She did not assume the recovery position she had been shown. She was upright in the current, arms flailing, legs pointing downward instead of forward, which is basically the worst possible position to be in. Her left foot lodged between two submerged rocks beneath the surface. The current immediately pinned her body face down with her foot anchored below. The force of the water against her back made it basically impossible for her to lift her head. The guide entered the water within seconds and reached her position, but the current was pinning her with so much force he could not rotate her body or free her foot. A second rafter climbed onto a rock downstream and tried to reach her from a different angle, but the water between them was too fast and deep to cross safely. By the time a throw rope was secured to a tree upstream and enough leverage applied to shift her position and dislodge her foot, she had been submerged face down for several minutes. CPR was started immediately on a rock shelf beside the river. Emergency services were contacted by satellite phone. A rescue team reached the gorge within about 45 minutes. Resuscitation efforts continued, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be drowning, with foot entrapment in a submerged rock formation documented as the contributing mechanism. Investigators noted that the feet downstream recovery position covered in the briefing is specifically designed to prevent the type of entrapment that occurred. If her feet had been forward and near the surface instead of dangling below her, the entrapment pretty much would not have happened. The rafting company reviewed its safety procedures and added a verbal confirmation step, where each participant had to repeat the recovery position back to the guide before launch. The guide was cleared of all fault. Gemma's friend gave her statement and went back to England. A selfie they took on the raft like 10 minutes before the rapid was still on Gemma's phone when they found it in her dry bag.
It was the evening of August 14th, 2018, a humid Saturday night in the waterfront district of Tampa. The wedding reception took place inside a newly renovated luxury ballroom overlooking the harbor, where yacht lights reflected across the water beyond the glass walls of the venue. Sabrina Vale was 34 years old and lived in Miami, where she worked as an office manager for a medical supply company. She projected wealth and importance despite living far beyond her means. Friends described her as demanding, argumentative, and obsessed with status. She expected special treatment everywhere she went and became openly hostile when she felt ignored or embarrassed in public. She attended the wedding as the +1 of Nathan Cole, one of the groom's longtime college friends. Very few guests had met her before that evening. By mid-evening, Sabrina had already become a problem. She complained repeatedly about her table placement, criticized staff over drink service, and argued with a bartender about the champagne selection. Several guests heard her call parts of the wedding decor cheap. As the night continued and alcohol kept flowing, she became more confrontational. Despite repeated announcements prohibiting smoking or vaping indoors, she openly used a vape device near the ballroom exits and dance floor several times. Security had already warned her. The announcements had already covered it. I genuinely cannot tell you what made her think the rules were for everyone else in that ballroom except her. Around 10:15 p.m., venue security approached her after multiple complaints from nearby guests and warned she would be removed if it continued. The confrontation drew attention from surrounding tables and visibly embarrassed her. She argued loudly with security before walking away toward the restricted backstage section behind the reception stage. The stage had been rebuilt that day, using synthetic drapery and fabric panels heavily coated in aerosol shimmer spray during setup. Unlike permanent venue materials, none of it was held to fire retardant standards, effectively turning the entire backstage arrangement into chemically primed material waiting for a spark. Sabrina entered the backstage area alone, removed a lighter, and attempted to light a cigarette near the rear stage curtains. The flame caught the aerosol residue coating the synthetic backdrop and spread faster than the fabric alone would ever have allowed. Guests near the stage heard shouting, followed by a sudden burst of flames rising behind the curtains. Fire spread rapidly upward through the synthetic drapery and hanging decorative panels surrounding the stage supports. Several guests initially mistook the flames for part of the reception lighting before smoke began pouring into the ballroom. Burning drapery and a collapsing decorative frame blocked the narrow service path behind the stage and temporarily trapped two nearby event workers. Sabrina, standing closest to the ignition point, became trapped near the rear backdrop as flames spread through the backstage corridor. Staff activated fire alarms, while others attempted to reach the trapped victims through heavy smoke and falling debris. Emergency services were called at approximately 10:18 p.m. as guests evacuated through the ballroom exits. Heat from the growing fire triggered the overhead sprinkler system and slowed the spread before firefighters arrived. Fire crews forced their way through the partially collapsed stage and pulled the two event workers out alive with severe burns and smoke inhalation injuries. Sabrina had remained trapped closest to where the fire started. Firefighters carried her through a rear service corridor, while paramedics began emergency treatment outside the venue entrance beneath emergency floodlights. She was transported to a nearby trauma hospital in critical condition with catastrophic burns and severe airway damage from superheated smoke inhalation. Despite multiple resuscitation attempts in the trauma unit, she was pronounced dead later that night. The fire was later ruled accidental ignition involving open flame and aerosol-treated synthetic decorative material. The venue introduced strict no-smoking policies and tighter backstage access restrictions for all future events.
It was February 6, 2015. The evening air in Orlando, Florida hung thick with humidity, clinging to the asphalt and the rows of parked cars outside an elementary school. Patricia Mendoza sat in her silver sedan, the engine idling, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Her face was flushed from rage after the volatile school board meeting that had just ended, where heated arguments and pointed accusations had left the room tense and silent in turns. Patricia had built her reputation as the most feared parent advocate in Orange County's school system. A former marketing executive turned full-time activist, she had dedicated the last 8 years to what she called educational accountability. She had confrontations with school administrators, teachers, and other parents she deemed inadequate. Local education officials knew her well. She had successfully lobbied for traffic pattern changes around 3 schools, always citing child safety while targeting families she personally disliked. Patricia's methods were calculated and ruthless. Her laptop contained detailed files on dozens of parents, noting everything from divorce proceedings to financial troubles. That evening's board meeting had been particularly volatile. She had publicly accused a single mother of neglecting her learning-disabled son, presenting printed screenshots of the woman's social media account posts as evidence of poor parenting. The woman had fled the meeting in tears while Patricia demanded the school investigate the family's home situation. Security eventually escorted her from the building. Patricia stormed through the school parking lot. She had successfully forced 2 families to transfer their children to different schools through similar campaigns, and this case would be her most public victory. At 7:43 in the evening, well outside active school hours, Patricia pulled out of the school parking lot while simultaneously typing a text message to one of her friends about the incident. Traffic cameras captured her sedan accelerating through the very school zone she had lobbied to expand. Her phone was later confirmed as visible in multiple frames after enhancement of nearby intersection camera footage as she approached the intersection of Colonial Drive and Semoran Boulevard. The light had been red for 8 seconds when her vehicle entered the intersection at approximately 47 miles per hour, never slowing down. Immediately, a delivery truck struck Patricia's sedan on the driver's side with devastating force, crushing the cabin and spinning the vehicle before it came to rest against a traffic signal pole. The truck driver immediately called 911 while several witnesses rushed to the wreckage, but the driver's door was completely compressed, making rescue impossible. Patricia's phone was found on the passenger floor, still displaying the half-finished text message she had been typing when she ran the red light. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes, but Patricia had already succumbed to her injuries. The medical examiner determined she died from massive chest trauma, internal bleeding, and complete spinal cord transection caused by blunt force crushing. Her dash cam footage, which survived the side impact despite partial damage, showed her looking down at her phone for the final 12 seconds before impact, completely oblivious to the red light ahead. The school district implemented new conduct policies for public meetings following Patricia's death. Her 2 teenage children were placed with relatives who later, according to court filings and family statements, revealed the toxic environment Patricia had created at home, where she had trained them to spy on classmates' families for her campaigns. It was May 14th, 2018. The Community Recreation Center in Central Florida sat quietly under midday heat. Temperatures had reached 88 degrees by noon. The outdoor pool area was cordoned off with orange barricades and multiple warning signs. The pool had been closed since the previous evening due to a filtration system malfunction. Water had been partially drained for repairs, leaving the depth uneven and unsafe. What was normally an 8-foot deep end now held approximately 3 feet of murky water. The shallow end was nearly empty, exposing stained concrete. Security cameras mounted on the building's exterior recorded the entrance area, but not the pool basin itself. Liza Perry was 61 years old. She worked part-time at a local retail store and visited the recreation center several times each week. Staff knew her as a regular swimmer who preferred early afternoon sessions. Friends described her as stubborn and dismissive of rules she considered inconvenient. That day, she had arrived at her usual time, unaware of the closure. When she found the pool area blocked, she grew visibly frustrated. Other patrons had turned away. Liza did not. She approached the barricade near the main entrance. The signs clearly stated the pool was closed for maintenance. No staff members were visible. Liza placed her towel and bag on a nearby bench. She wore a one-piece swimsuit and swim cap. She gripped the barricade and climbed over, stepping onto the pool deck. The water level was not immediately obvious. Overhead, sun created glare across the surface, and the water had taken on a clouded, greenish tint from stagnant sediment. To someone familiar with the pool, the visual cues that should have signaled danger were obscured. The murky color masked the true depth. Her brain expected what had always been there. Liza walked to the edge of the deep end, where she typically entered. She did not pause to check the depth. She raised her arms above her head and dove forward in a clean arc. Her body entered the water head first. The dive was executed with practiced form. Her hands broke the surface, followed by her head and torso. Within a fraction of a second, her head struck the concrete floor. The impact was direct and forceful. Her cervical vertebrae fractured at multiple levels. The spinal cord sustained a catastrophic high cervical injury. All voluntary movement below her neck ceased instantly. Her body went limp. She remained face down in the shallow water, unable to lift her head or move her arms. With her respiratory muscles paralyzed, shallow reflex gasps occurred briefly before breathing failed. Unable to cough or turn, water entered her airway. Within seconds, drowning was complete. The pool area remained empty. No one had witnessed the dive. Liza's body remained motionless, partially submerged. A staff member conducting a routine check noticed the displaced barricade approximately 20 minutes later. He walked onto the pool deck and saw the body in the water. He radioed for help and entered the pool. Another staff member assisted in pulling Liza onto the deck. Her skin was pale and cool. They began CPR immediately. No pulse was detected. Emergency responders arrived within 7 minutes. Paramedics continued resuscitation efforts, but found no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators reviewed security footage. The video showed Liza climbing the barricade and walking to the pool edge. The camera angle was fixed on the entrance and did not capture the pool basin, so the dive was not recorded. The county medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cervical spine fracture with secondary drowning. The death was ruled accidental. No charges were filed. The recreation center reopened the pool 5 days later.
It was February 8, 2014, in Halstead Bay on Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. The sky was a flat white overcast, and the frozen lake stretched outward in uneven shades of gray where snow, pressure cracks, and wind-scoured ice blurred distance across the bay. Zariah Aldenor was 41 years old, working as a dental hygienist in a private clinic in a suburban medical district. Coworkers described her as confident to the point of confrontation, often correcting others with certainty, even outside her expertise. She had ice fished as a child but had not done so in years, and her understanding of lake ice was based on memory rather than current safety knowledge. She arrived at the public access with a 14-year-old neighbor's son and no safety gear beyond winter clothing. Although local advisories warned that ice beyond the nearshore zone was unpredictably thin over the deep channel, and a conservation officer repeated that warning in person, Zariah dismissed it as overcautious, pointed to another fisherman farther out as proof the ice was fine, and walked onto the lake anyway.
She's already past the shoreline here, and the officer is probably watching her feet more than her face.
The officer approached her twice and warned that the area ahead contained dangerously thin ice. Zariah dismissed the warning, pointed to fishermen farther out on the lake, and insisted the officer was exaggerating the danger, which is scary to think of, especially she's bringing a kid with her. When he repeated the warning and told her not to go out there, she got more confrontational, even questioning his competence and saying she had been on ice like this before without any issues. The officer made it clear he couldn't physically stop her, but strongly advised her to turn back. Zariah dismissed him again and stepped onto the ice, while the teenager stayed on shore.
About 200 yards out, she reached the area above the submerged channel where the ice suddenly got much thinner.
It gave way without warning, breaking open under her weight. She fell into near-freezing water and immediately went into cold shock, gasping uncontrollably and involuntarily pulling water in. Her winter clothes soaked through and pulled her down. She came back up briefly and grabbed at the ice edge, but it kept breaking under her grip. Her movements started getting unsteady as the exposure worsened. She went under again, resurfaced slightly away from the original break, and kept struggling against ice that was too thin to hold her. That alone is a scary experience, not just for her, but for the teenager as well. The teenager on shore witnessed her hands pressing against the underside of the ice before they stopped moving. Emergency responders from a county water rescue unit arrived within half an hour, but unstable conditions delayed access onto the ice. When divers were finally deployed, they located her beneath the surface, carried laterally by a weak current under the ice sheet. Resuscitation was initiated on scene and continued during transport to a regional hospital, but she did not regain vital signs and was pronounced dead later that morning. A medical examination determined drowning due to cold water immersion. Injuries to her hand showed severe abrasions and torn nails, consistent with repeated attempts to pull herself onto failing ice. Findings indicated rapid incapacitation consistent with cold shock response, and officials noted that survival time in those conditions without flotation support would have been extremely limited, making timely rescue Unlikely. The teenager was not publicly named and withdrew from school for a period following the incident. Years later, he contributed to ice safety awareness efforts at public access points around the lake, focusing on improved warnings and safety education. It was December 23, 2016 in Los Angeles. Terminal 4 was operating under peak holiday congestion, with delayed arrivals and heavy baggage loads creating sustained operational strain, though systems remained functional. Melissa Grant was a 44-year-old, former collegiate runner, now a corporate logistics consultant after a career-ending injury. She traveled frequently for airline efficiency and supply chain work and was highly structured, but increasingly impatient with transit delays, often viewing routine congestion as procedural failure rather than normal operations. Baggage handling used automated conveyor systems beneath passenger floors, with restricted service corridors, rotating rollers, and timed sorting cycles. Access was strictly prohibited due to mechanical hazards, with safety maintained through barriers, signage, and staff enforcement rather than immediate shutdown capability. Her flight got in late, so she already had a pretty tight connection. On top of that, her luggage was delayed because of a system backlog, and even though staff told her it would come out in batches, she stayed at the carousel anyway, kind of pressing them for it to come faster, while other passengers were already picking up their bags. I've definitely seen people staring at the same empty carousel like it'll make the bags appear sooner. As delays continued, she repeatedly questioned baggage handling procedures and requested manual retrieval. Staff issued multiple verbal warnings, but she intermittently left the designated claim zone and approached service boundaries on several occasions despite being directed back. During a brief lull between baggage cycles, she misread nearby signage and maintenance notices as an alternative retrieval route and crossed a flexible barrier into a restricted service corridor despite staff calling out to stop her. She continued forward without stopping or rechecking, focused entirely on getting to her luggage, in that narrow, almost automatic state where I'd just keep going without second guessing anything. This placed her beyond a restricted service barrier into an operational maintenance corridor accessed via a service entry point adjacent to the conveyor system. Staff immediately attempted to redirect her, but she continued forward, attempting to locate her luggage within the operational zone. A new baggage batch entered moments later, reactivating full movement through the section she had entered. She moved closer to the belt interface, now within the active conveyor envelope, as her footing became unstable on the narrow, shifting walkway. She became caught at a transfer point between a moving belt and adjacent drive rollers, where pinch point forces drew her forward into the machinery. Her clothing and body were pulled into the roller interface, resulting in severe compressive and shear injuries consistent with conveyor entrapment. The conveyor was shut down within seconds via emergency stop activation, but severe compressive injuries had already occurred during the entrapment at the active roller transfer point before full stoppage. Staff extracted her once motion stopped, and emergency medical teams were dispatched directly into the baggage handling area through service corridors. Response time was recorded at under 6 minutes from the initial alarm. It happened fast, but not fast enough to undo what had already been done. She was rushed to a nearby trauma center in critical condition. Later medical reports said she had severe crush injuries from getting caught in the conveyor system, including major internal injuries, torn blood vessels, and other compression-related damage that likely happened before the system was fully shut down. Investigators confirmed all conveyor H systems operated as designed and emergency stops functioned correctly, with no mechanical failure found. The restricted area was off-limits, with safety dependent on strict separation between public and operational zones. The investigation concluded that repeated disregard of staff warnings and entry into a restricted operational area led to the incident. Following the incident, the airport reinforced barriers around conveyor access points, improved signage visibility, and added additional safety cutoffs near service corridors. Airline training materials were also updated to address escalation behavior in baggage claim areas during high-volume travel periods, emphasizing strict adherence to operational boundaries. It was August 22nd, 2019, and a 12-seat tour bus climbed a gravel switchback road above the tree line in the Bolivian Altiplano, where the air was thin enough to feel in your chest with every breath, and the brown and gold landscape stretched flat to the horizon under a sky so blue it almost looked fake. Bryn McAllister was 41 years old and owned a boutique fitness studio in Calgary, Canada, the kind with branded water bottles and motivational slogans on the walls. She was lean, disciplined, and very publicly fit, the type of person whose whole identity was pretty much built around her body. Tour group members said Bryn told basically everyone at the airport that she was training for her third marathon. And on the bus ride to the first hotel, she asked the guide how many of the group were in decent shape, and then answered her own question by listing her resting heart rate and weekly running mileage like it was a resume. When several members of the group took altitude medication they had brought for the trip, Bryn waved it off and said she didn't put chemicals in her body. 2 other group members accepted their tablets quietly. She made sure everyone knew she was the one person who didn't need them. She didn't just say no, she made a whole production out of it, so every person in that van knew she was above needing help. And in my experience, that kind of confidence only ever goes one direction. Day 1, at roughly 11,000 feet, she was fine, energetic, talkative, no visible symptoms. She did a short hike with the group that afternoon and was honestly near the front the whole time, though that night she mentioned that she hadn't slept great and felt kind of nauseous, which she blamed on the food, of course. The group went higher on day 2, got to just over 13,000 feet by late morning. By early afternoon, Bryn had this headache she brought up once and then kinda just stopped mentioning. She also looked slightly unsteady during a stop at a viewpoint, leaning against the railing in a way another traveler noticed. By late afternoon, she had slowed considerably on a short walk from the bus to a lookout, stopping twice to catch her breath on what was basically flat ground. The guide checked on her and she said she was just tired from the altitude and would be fine after some rest. She didn't come down for dinner. The guide went to check on her room like 30 minutes after dinner and found her just sitting on the edge of her bed, clearly confused and honestly not able to answer even simple questions. Her coordination was poor, her speech was slurred, and she couldn't follow simple instructions to stand or walk toward the door. When the guide asked her to squeeze his hand, she didn't seem to understand the request. He pretty much knew right away what was happening and called emergency services. She was transported by ambulance to a lower altitude hospital roughly 2 hours away. By the time she arrived, the swelling in her brain had progressed significantly despite emergency treatment and descent to lower altitude. She was placed on oxygen and monitored through the night, but her condition kept deteriorating. She never regained full consciousness. She died the following morning. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, which is basically when your brain swells from lack of oxygen at elevation, and once it gets past a certain point, even getting to lower ground can't reverse the damage. Investigators noted the guide had recommended altitude medication during the pre-trip briefing, which she declined, and that early symptoms were present on day 2, but she didn't report them until it was too late. The guide's documentation of her refusal and her stated reason were included in the incident file. The tour company expanded its altitude screening procedures and strengthened pre-trip medical briefings for high-altitude routes. Her fitness studio put up a short memorial on social media, and honestly, her marathon training page was still live months later.
It was September 18th, 2019, a warm Saturday night near the northern edge of the Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya. The wedding had been planned as a luxury destination celebration for nearly 2 years. Guests had flown in different places. Danielle Mercer was 46 years old and lived in Dallas. She had built a logistics software company from scratch after years in freight coordination and warehouse management. She started with a rented office and 3 employees, and eventually sold a major stake for tens of millions of dollars. She was also active on social media, where blunt business advice clips attracted a large following. People described her in contradictory ways: brilliant, funny in the right mood, genuinely generous sometimes, difficult to tolerate for long. She liked calling herself self-made and openly looked down on anyone she considered weak or unimpressive. The groom was her younger cousin. She had not originally planned to attend. Earlier that year, she described the wedding as an expensive safari photo shoot, pretending to be a marriage. The groom's father still insisted she come because investors and business associates would be there. Her success still carried social weight in those circles, despite everything that came with her. At the reserve, her mood shifted constantly. That afternoon, she entertained guests with stories about building her company during the 2008 freight collapse. An hour later, she loudly asked a lodge employee whether he understood basic English after a transportation mix-up. By the time the reception started, many guests were already avoiding her table. The reception took place in a large open-air pavilion surrounded by lantern poles and portable floodlights, powered by generators behind the kitchen tents. Beyond the lit perimeter, the landscape disappeared almost immediately into darkness. Rangers had warned guests repeatedly not to wander past the reception area after sunset. Wildlife moved close to the property at night. Earlier that day, guests returning from safari drives had reported buffalo near one of the service roads less than a quarter-mile from the lodge. Alcohol had been flowing for hours by the time Danielle took the microphone shortly before 10 p.m. She started normally enough before drifting into increasingly uncomfortable remarks about wealth, marriage, and family image. Guests laughed nervously. Others tried interrupting her quietly from nearby tables. She talked over all of them and eventually implied the bride had pursued the groom because of his family connections. The groom stepped forward and told staff to cut the microphone. Can you imagine? She flew in from afar just to ruin the day with her words. I don't know what she thought was going to happen after that. Danielle reacted badly. She shouted at relatives near the stage, grabbed her phone, and walked away from the pavilion into the darkness beyond the reception lights. She began live streaming herself while walking toward a line of parked Land Cruisers used earlier for safari tours. Her words became repetitive and slurred. At one point, she could be heard saying nobody even likes each other half the time. 2 lodge employees and a ranger moved after her when they noticed movement near the brush line beyond the vehicles. They called out to her. Danielle laughed at the warning and kept walking. What happened next was over before anyone could reach her. The buffalo had apparently been moving along the brush line before noise, vehicle positioning, and floodlights pushed it into the narrow space between the parked Land Cruisers. The animal was massive and moving at full speed when Danielle came around the side of the nearest vehicle. The first impact knocked her off her feet and threw her beside the Land Cruiser. The animal didn't stop. Startled and cornered between the vehicles, it trampled and gored in a blind panic before rangers reached the scene and fired warning shots into the air. She was declared dead at the scene after emergency responders arrived. There was nothing to be done by the time anyone reached her. The wedding reception ended immediately. Rangers escorted all guests back to their lodges in secured vehicles. Local authorities sealed off the surrounding area overnight for investigation.
It was September 18th, 2014. The afternoon sun baked the desert asphalt along Interstate 10 near Mesa, Arizona, casting heat ripples that distorted the lines of traffic moving steadily at 75 miles per hour. Dust devils stirred along the shoulder, lifting small stones and loose paper into brief spirals. Eleanor Brickman, a 67-year-old retired bookkeeper, sat in her unregistered sedan at a gas station tucked between the frontage road and the interstate. Her hand-painted wooden license plate leaned slightly to the left on the bumper, the rough brushstrokes clearly visible to anyone paying attention. For the past 3 years, Eleanor had immersed herself in sovereign citizen ideology, drawn in by online forums she had discovered after her husband's death. Friends and relatives described her as increasingly distrustful of any government authority, convinced that some laws were merely suggestions imposed on the uninformed. Neighbors recalled her repeatedly confronting postal workers over routine deliveries, filming city employees performing inspections, and openly refusing to comply with parking regulations or permit requirements. Eleanor kept a notebook filled with scribbled arguments about voluntary contracts and constitutional loopholes, which she often referred to aloud when explaining her actions to anyone nearby. That afternoon, Eleanor had clashed with a road maintenance worker assigned to shoulder cleanup. He had insisted she could not park her vehicle with a wooden license plate, prompting a heated exchange in which Eleanor loudly declared all vehicle registration to be voluntary contracts she had never signed. The worker threatened to call the police and recalled Eleanor's face flushed. She retreated to her trunk and carefully retrieved a hand-painted stop sign. She announced aloud that she would stage a constitutional demonstration against traffic enforcement, likely convinced that her actions would assert her legal independence. Eleanor walked along an unfenced frontage access point leading to an interstate overpass, then descended to the shoulder of the busy highway through a maintenance gap in the barrier fencing. Multiple witnesses later estimated she stood on the concrete barrier separating the shoulder from the right lane for approximately 30 to 60 seconds, holding her homemade sign and shouting about constitutional rights. At least one motorist later reported calling 911 to report a pedestrian near the lanes, but traffic continued flowing at highway speeds. drivers unaware of the developing situation. Eleanor's behavior escalated as she stepped closer to the active lanes, apparently believing her protest would force vehicles to acknowledge her authority. Eleanor walked directly into the right travel lane of Interstate 10. A traffic monitoring camera mounted near the overpass captured her stepping into the path of oncoming vehicles, her stop sign raised above her head. A commercial semi-truck traveling at highway speed, later estimated between 70 and 75 miles per hour, had no time to react. The driver later reported seeing Eleanor appear suddenly in his lane, but couldn't stop in time. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Eleanor's body was thrown forward dozens of feet away, landing in the median strip. The truck driver immediately pulled over and called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, with troopers assuming control of the scene, but Eleanor showed no signs of life. The coroner's report detailed massive blunt force trauma, including complete chest compression, severe head injury, and catastrophic internal bleeding. The injuries were deemed unsurvivable, with death occurring within seconds of impact given the forces involved. Traffic backed up for miles as investigators documented the scene, and traffic cameras provided clear evidence of Eleanor's deliberate actions. The truck driver, a 15-year veteran of long-haul driving, left the profession permanently after the incident. It was October 2nd, 2017. The residential construction site sat on the outskirts of a developing subdivision in central Arizona. The afternoon sun beat down on exposed dirt and gravel. Framing for a 2-story home stood partially complete, with wooden studs rising against a cloudless sky. Extension ladders leaned against the structure. Orange warning tape stretched across the driveway entrance. The ground was uneven, covered in loose gravel, scattered lumber, and electrical wire. Workers moved between tasks across the lot. Hallie Bates was 52 years old. She worked as a freelance property inspector, contracted by buyers to assess homes before purchase. Colleagues described her as thorough but impatient, often cutting corners to finish jobs quickly. That afternoon, she had arrived without notifying the construction crew. She was not authorized to be there. The property was weeks from completion. Hallie had been hired to inspect a neighboring home, but decided to examine this unfinished structure as well. She carried a clipboard and a digital camera. Hallie ducked under the warning tape and walked onto the site. A worker in a hard hat approached her, explaining that the site was restricted and asking if Hallie had clearance. Hallie barely looked up, dismissing the concern with a wave. She informed the worker that she was a licensed inspector and didn't require permission. The worker mentioned safety protocols. Hallie cut him off, stating that she knew construction sites better than most workers. She moved toward the rear, where a 24-foot aluminum extension ladder rested against the second-floor framing. The ladder sat on loose gravel with no stabilizing base or tie-off. Another worker called out, warning that the ladder hadn't been properly secured. Hallie ignored the shout entirely, positioning herself at the base. She tested the ladder briefly, then began climbing. The ladder swayed as she ascended. She reached approximately 18 feet. The base shifted laterally. The gravel offered no traction. Hallie's weight caused the ladder to slide. She leaned backward instinctively, trying to regain balance. The ladder continued moving. Hallie fell. Her body rotated as she dropped 18 feet. Her upper back and neck struck the sharp edge of the poured concrete foundation. The impact fractured her cervical spine, severing critical neural pathways. The force caused her head to strike the ground. She landed on her back in the gravel. Her arms and legs did not move. Her eyes remained open but unfocused. 2 workers saw the fall and ran toward her. One shouted for someone to call emergency services. The other knelt beside Hallie but did not move her. Blood pooled beneath her head. Her breathing became rapid and irregular, short gasps that grew weaker. Within 30 seconds, the agonal respiration ceased. One worker panicked and attempted compressions before pulling back, realizing the extent of the trauma. The compressions had no effect. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics found no pulse or respiratory effort. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. They pronounced her dead at the scene. The ladder remained where it had fallen. Investigators documented the site. They noted the absence of ladder stabilization and a loose gravel surface. Workers confirmed Hallie had entered without permission, dismissed safety warnings, and refused to follow protocols. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as high cervical fracture with spinal cord transection and secondary traumatic brain injury. The death was ruled accidental. No criminal charges were filed. The construction company paused work for 2 days while safety protocols were reviewed.
It was July 18th, 2019, during a prolonged heat wave in central Texas. Temperatures had stayed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days, and even after sunset, the air remained heavy and uncomfortable across the city. Pamela Joy Coltrix was 42, and she lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a pretty average residential complex. She worked from home, so she was there most of the time, and that week especially, she'd just been stuck dealing with the heat day after day. It was one of those stretches where it doesn't really cool down, even at night, and according to neighbors, she was getting more and more frustrated about it. They said she'd been complaining a lot, not just about the temperature, but about the building in general. She'd often argue with management too, and she had this way of seeing the rules like they were just there to make things harder for tenants, like they didn't really have a good reason behind them. The apartment building used a centrally controlled air conditioning system. In an effort to reduce electricity costs during overnight hours, management had implemented scheduled reductions that limited cooling output after midnight. Pam was furious about it. It's already been building up around her for a while. It makes me feel like the argument wasn't just one bad day.
Over several days, she kept complaining that the landlord was stealing air conditioning that tenants were already paying for.
Staff explained the system was still running and only slightly reduced overnight for energy savings during the heat wave, but she dismissed it as excuses. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she was that she was being personally cheated. Just outside her second-floor window was a large commercial AC condenser serving part of the building. It was part of the cooling system, but it actually pushed heat out as it ran. Still, she fixated on it as if being near it meant being closer to the building's cooling itself. It's literally right outside her window, which makes that fixation a lot more immediate. At some point that evening, she decided on an unusual solution. If the apartment itself wasn't going to be cold enough, she would go directly to the equipment she believed was producing the cooling. Shortly after midnight, she opened her bedroom window and climbed onto the exterior ledge. From there, she attempted to reach the air conditioning condenser mounted just outside the wall, which really sounds absurd to hear. The equipment was never designed to support a person's weight. Its sheet metal casing offered almost no secure footing, and the constant vibration from the compressor made balance difficult even before movement began. Despite that, she continued, a brief metallic sound echoed through the exterior wall, followed by a shout. As she tried to adjust her position on the unit, she lost her footing on the unstable surface. During the fall, she reached for a nearby electrical conduit fixed to the building wall, trying to slow or stop herself. The conduit immediately failed under the sudden load, either bending sharply or tearing free from its mounting points. With nothing left to hold onto, she fell roughly 1 story onto the concrete below. The impact caused a fatal head injury and extensive blunt force trauma. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found her unresponsive. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no indication of foul play or mechanical failure, and the physical evidence was consistent with an accidental fall from exterior building equipment.
Following the incident, apartment management installed additional window restrictors and warning notices near units overlooking exterior mechanical equipment.
Residents were also reminded that the building's cooling infrastructure was not designed for public access under any circumstances. It was September 14th, 2013 at a Castle Hotel in rural Scotland. The building mixed restored guest areas with older sections that were restricted due to decay and unsafe, sealed corridors. The guest was Lauren Ebio, a 6-year-old solo traveler who had spent months putting together her Scotland trip. She'd gone out of her way to book historic places instead of regular hotels because she loved the idea of staying somewhere that actually felt connected to the country's past. This castle was supposed to be one of the highlights of the trip. Lauren was also the kind of person who paid close attention to everything during a stay and wasn't shy about complaining when something bothered her. So when she kept hearing noise coming from restricted parts of the building, she got increasingly irritated. Staff repeatedly told her it was maintenance work in the older wings, but she never really bought that explanation. The way she saw it, if she was paying to stay in a castle, she should be able to experience all of it. The hotel was split into guest areas and restricted sections. Public spaces were reinforced, while older service corridors remained unstable with uneven steps, sealed drop-offs, and hidden shafts off-limits to guests. Signs and barriers marked the boundaries, and staff repeatedly warned visitors not to enter, noting these areas were unmaintained and could contain open drops. Lauren contacted reception several times about noise behind the walls and insisted she should have access to the whole property because of what she had paid for. Staff maintained the restricted wings were operational areas, not guest access. It reads like she didn't really accept that explanation, even after it was repeated more than once.
Later that evening, she left her room and moved beyond the main guest corridor into a side passage leading toward a service wing. A maintenance adjustment earlier in the day had left a partial gap at the entrance barrier.
Inside, lighting dropped noticeably, and the floor changed from restored stone tile to uneven original masonry with gaps and signs of settling. The corridor narrowed as she went deeper, with more irregular stonework and areas showing incomplete or paused repairs leading toward a secondary junction. At the junction, she stepped onto a temporary covering panel placed over an old maintenance shaft. The panel had been partially unseated from its frame during earlier maintenance work and was not properly secured. It shifted under her weight and gave way, opening a vertical drop beneath the corridor. The fall dropped her directly into a deep service shaft within the castle foundation, with uneven stonework and exposed metal fixtures along the lower levels where maintenance infrastructure and structural supports were installed.
Staff only realized that she was missing during routine room checks and when the door logs didn't quite match up.
They went back through the internal records to track where she had gone, but getting to the shaft itself took time since it was down through maintenance routes and restricted corridors in the older, segmented parts of the building. Her body was recovered from the lower maintenance level. Injuries were consistent with a high-energy vertical fall onto uneven stone and structural fixtures in a confined vertical shaft environment. Medical findings listed the cause of death as traumatic injuries from a fall into a maintenance access shaft. Investigators found no failure of public safety systems, concluding that the incident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted service corridor. The final report determined that the area was clearly outside guest access zones and not intended for public use. After the investigation was completed, Lauren's remains were released to her family for repatriation. Following the incident, the hotel reinforced service corridor boundaries, installed permanent locking barriers, and updated guest signage throughout the property. It was July 8, 2014 in Queensland, Australia. A reef flat near a coastal stretch was exposed at low tide, revealing broad coral platforms that appeared stable under clear morning skies, though conditions were already shifting faster than forecast. The couple were Emma Clark, 29, and Daniel Hughes, 31, visiting Australia on a short leisure trip. Emma was a freelance lifestyle content creator trying to grow her travel social media work, while Daniel worked in corporate marketing and generally preferred following local guidance when traveling. Earlier in the trip, Emma had become increasingly frustrated with what she saw as excessive rules and restrictions at tourist destinations. She often complained that staff exaggerated risks and limited access to places people had traveled thousands of miles to see. Daniel usually avoided arguments and often went along with her decisions even when he disagreed. That morning, warning signs and local staff advised visitors to begin returning before the incoming tide window. Daniel suggested heading back once water started creeping into the lower channels, but Emma insisted they still had plenty of time for photos and dismissed the warnings as overly cautious. I've noticed a lot of people wait until they can actually see the water moving before they start heading back. As they continued farther across the reef, the incoming tide accelerated through lower channels not visible from their position. Daniel suggested turning back when some of their earlier crossings began disappearing underwater, but Emma pushed on, convinced they could still make it back without a problem. They only attempted to return once water movement became impossible to ignore. By then, the coral surface was coated in a thin film of seawater and algae, making it highly slippery. Daniel moved ahead, trying to find the safest route back to shore while urging Emma to follow, but a surge of incoming water cut through a connecting channel between them, isolating them on separate sections of reef. Within minutes, the exposed platform turned into broken coral pockets, with water moving rapidly through them. As conditions worsened, Daniel attempted to cross toward Emma rather than continue toward a safer route alone. He stepped into a submerged tidal channel where the reef dropped into deeper water. A surge pushed him sideways through the reef system as the current intensified. Emma attempted to move toward him, but the widening channels and incoming water made it impossible. Witnesses from higher ground contacted emergency services after observing both individuals being cut off by widening water channels. A nearby coastal guide issued a radio alert, and response teams were deployed by vessel and shoreline access shortly after notification, with initial assets reaching the reef perimeter within approximately 20 minutes, depending on launch conditions and coastal access points.
Even from above, it's hard to tell how fast the channels are linking until the crossings you just used stopped being crossings at all. I've seen how quickly that shift happens on this kind of reef, and it's always faster than it looks from a distance.
Rescue crews recovered Daniel's body first from a submerged coral trench where water movement had trapped him against uneven rock formations. Emma was later found farther along a connected channel, partially submerged in deeper water where currents had intensified. Both died from drowning after becoming trapped by rapidly rising water that overtook the reef flat and cut off their return route. Medical findings listed the cause of death as drowning due to tidal entrapment, with contributing coral abrasions and blunt trauma sustained while being swept across shallow reef structures. Investigators confirmed that tidal conditions were within expected ranges, but advanced faster than they appeared at reef level. The report concluded that the couple had remained beyond the recommended turnaround point despite visible warnings, delaying their return until safe crossings were already disappearing. Daniel's attempt to reach Emma after they became separated further exposed him to the strongest tidal channels. The site was later upgraded with elevated exits and automated tide warning systems to reduce similar incidents. It was October 9th, 2014, and a thin afternoon rain had turned the unpaved surface of a mountain pass road in the Peruvian highlands into a slick ribbon of red-brown mud, where the road cut across a slope at roughly 12,000 feet, with no guardrail and a drop of several hundred feet on the outside edge. Deirdre Stallworth was 52 years old and worked as a corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm in Denver, Colorado. Super precise, super controlled, and pretty much always the most prepared person in whatever room she walked into. She had planned this whole solo driving tour of the Peruvian highlands herself, with routes mapped out, hotels booked, rental car reserved, weeks ahead of time. The employee at the rental counter later said Deirdre had overruled his route suggestion before he even finished the sentence, told him she had driven mountain roads in the Swiss Alps, and that she didn't need a local driver. When he continued to recommend a different vehicle with better clearance for the mountain roads, she asked to speak with his manager. She left the counter in the sedan she originally booked. The rental guy said he had made the same recommendation to dozens of clients before, and most of them just said okay and took the driver, but she looked at him like he had insulted her intelligence, and that's the detail from this whole story I keep coming back to, because he was a 20-something kid at a rental counter genuinely trying to keep a stranger alive, and she treated him like he was wasting her time. The road she chose was a known high-risk route with a history of vehicle accidents, especially during rainy season when the unpaved surface turned to loose mud and gravel. The switchbacks narrowed to a single lane in places with sheer drops on the outside and no guardrails or barriers of any kind. Locals who used the road regularly knew to honk before blind curves and pull to the inside when passing. By early afternoon, rain had been falling for over an hour, and the surface was honestly getting worse with every vehicle that came through. Tire ruts from earlier traffic had filled with muddy water, making it basically impossible to tell solid ground from soft spots. Deirdre was traveling alone on a switchback section when the vehicle's outside wheels lost traction on wet gravel. The sedan's low clearance and standard road tires had no grip on the slick surface. The vehicle lost traction entering the curve and began sliding toward the outside edge of the road. She appeared to have tried to correct. Investigators found evidence of hard steering input and braking, but on the loose, wet surface, the correction only made the slide worse. The rear wheels went over first, and the vehicle just tipped, rolling multiple times down the steep slope and dropping several hundred feet before it came to rest against a rocky outcropping. The cabin was pretty much completely deformed from the impacts. A passing truck driver spotted the fresh tire marks and damaged road edge roughly an hour later and pulled over to look down the slope. He could see the vehicle far below against the rocks. He contacted local authorities by radio. Rescue teams hiked down to the vehicle, which honestly took over an hour just because of how steep it was. Deirdre was found inside, still partially held by the seatbelt. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be multi-system blunt force trauma consistent with a prolonged vehicle rollover down a steep grade, with injuries to the head, chest, and extremities. The vehicle showed no mechanical failure. The cause was entirely environmental and driver-related. The rental company added seasonal restrictions on certain mountain routes and expanded written hazard disclosures in its agreements. The specific route was flagged going forward with a required acknowledgement signature. Her law firm put out a brief statement. The rental employee's recommendation and her refusal were both documented in the incident file.
It was the evening of August 14th, 2014, a Saturday. Hot and humid the way Charleston gets in late summer. A waterfront hotel overlooking the harbor was hosting a wedding reception on its upper event level. Vanessa Harper was 33 and worked in Atlanta selling luxury cosmetics. People who knew her described her the same way: competitive, attention-seeking, skilled at turning uncomfortable situations into performances. She arrived with her boyfriend, who had recently separated from his wife. The divorce was still ongoing. His wife, Elena, had also been invited. The bride had stayed friends with both of them for years. Vanessa and Elena shared older history too. They had attended the same high school more than a decade earlier, with conflicts serious enough for administrators to intervene repeatedly before Vanessa eventually transferred. She blamed Elena for most of it. Former classmates privately disagreed. When the two women spotted each other across the ballroom, the recognition was immediate. Vanessa started causing friction before dinner was served, complaining to staff about seating, making loud comments about the champagne, interrupting conversations, then acting cheerful moments later as though nothing had happened. Elena stayed near relatives and avoided engaging, which seemed to irritate Vanessa further. As the evening continued and alcohol circulated, Vanessa grew louder. She made jokes about relationships where one person got too comfortable to leave, comments about people whose entire personality was being the ex-wife, and at one point, stepped directly between Elena and another guest mid-conversation and simply stood there. Her boyfriend told her twice to calm down. Both times she snapped back sharply enough that he stopped trying. Even the person who came with her tried to stop it, and she shut him down. At that point, I don't think anyone in that ballroom could have reached her. A few guests attempted to diffuse things with humor. Vanessa brushed them aside and kept escalating. Around 9:45, guests moved upstairs to the rooftop terrace for group photographs overlooking the harbor. The terrace was narrower and more crowded than the ballroom. Along one edge sat a metal and glass safety barrier overlooking the harbor access level several stories below. Hotel staff had placed a temporary raised photography platform near that section of railing, positioned unusually close to the barrier because of the limited space, with the platform's elevated surface bringing anyone standing on it significantly nearer to the top of the railing than they would otherwise be. Drinks had been spilling throughout the evening, and parts of the stone floor near the photo area had become slick. Elena had nearly made it through the night without a direct confrontation. Then relatives gathered everyone near the terrace edge for a photograph, and Vanessa stepped into the middle of the group before anyone could object. She made a remark about replacing old memories with better ones, then shifted into comments about failed marriages. Elena finally turned and quietly said this was not the time or place. Vanessa talked over her. The two women began speaking at the same time while nearby conversations stopped. The photographer stepped back. Then Vanessa made one more remark about failed marriages. Someone reached for her arm. Vanessa jerked free and collided shoulder first with Elena. Elena shoved her backward harder than she intended. Vanessa lost her footing on the wet platform surface. Because the platform sat so close to the railing, she had almost no space to recover before her momentum carried her into the barrier. She grabbed for it, but the backward pitch was already too fast. The upper half of her body went over before anyone nearby could catch her. Several guests said they didn't realize she had gone over until people near the railing started screaming. She fell several stories onto the harbor access area below. Emergency services were called immediately. Vanessa suffered catastrophic injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later interviewed more than 30 wedding guests and reviewed security footage from both levels. The hotel subsequently changed how rooftop events were staged, including removing temporary photography platforms from areas near the terrace edge during crowded gatherings.
It was May 29th, 2013. The afternoon heat in Scottsdale, Arizona, shimmered off Spanish tile rooftops as Donna Kruger stood in her backyard, squinting at the cloudless sky. At 45, she had spent the last 3 months waging what neighbors described as an increasingly erratic campaign against delivery drones, convinced they were violating her property rights and spying on her daily routines. Donna had inherited her grandfather's 12-gauge shotgun after his death the previous winter, but possessed no formal firearms training beyond loading shells. A former insurance adjuster who had been laid off 2 years earlier, she spent her days monitoring online forums about property rights and airspace laws, becoming convinced that commercial drones represented a personal invasion. Her social media posts showed an escalating obsession with defending her territory, often photographing aircraft overhead and researching legal precedents about airspace ownership. Modern delivery drones operate at altitudes between 200 to 400 feet, well within federal airspace regulations, and in 2013 were primarily limited to small test programs and survey flights rather than widespread consumer delivery. Donna had filed multiple complaints with local authorities about drone activity over her neighborhood, claiming the aircraft were conducting surveillance and violating her privacy rights. That Tuesday morning, Donna had received another dismissive response from the authorities regarding her complaints about unauthorized drone flights. Neighbors reported hearing her shouting about taking matters into her own hands while pacing in her backyard. Around 2 in the afternoon, a test survey drone, operating as part of a limited pilot program, approached her neighborhood, following its programmed route to a nearby address. Donna grabbed her grandfather's shotgun and climbed onto her single-story home's Spanish tile roof. Despite having no experience with either firearms or roof navigation, the tiles, heated to over 140 degrees by the desert sun, made footing treacherous as she positioned herself near the roof's edge. Witnesses from neighboring properties watched as Donna raised the heavy shotgun toward the approaching drone, which was flying approximately 250 feet overhead. She had loaded the weapon with standard birdshot, completely inadequate for the distance and target. When she fired, the unexpected recoil caused her to lose footing on the superheated tiles. She tumbled backward, sliding down the steeply pitched roof, before falling approximately 20 feet into her landscaped garden below. Her body struck a decorative boulder arrangement, causing massive blunt force trauma to her head and torso. The shotgun fell separately and discharged upon impact due to inertia, causing the firing pin to strike, sending the second round harmlessly into the air. The combination of steep slope, heat, and heavy recoil made the slide unavoidable. A neighbor immediately called 911 after witnessing the fall. Paramedics arrived under 10 minutes, finding Donna conscious but bleeding heavily from multiple head wounds. Despite their efforts to stabilize her condition, she succumbed to severe brain trauma and internal bleeding during transport to the hospital. The medical examiner determined that Donna died from massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with contributing factors including heat stress, dehydration, and blood loss. She had remained conscious for approximately 6 minutes after the fall, before losing consciousness permanently. Her estate was settled quietly, with the property sold after extensive cleanup and removal of the blood-stained landscaping where she had fallen. It was August 21st, 2016. The suburban rail station in northern Illinois was crowded on a late weeknight. The platform stretched approximately 300 feet along the tracks, lit by overhead fluorescent fixtures. A service delay had been announced 20 minutes earlier, causing passengers to cluster near the benches. Audible announcements echoed through mounted speakers, warning of an inbound train. Rhea Cole was 47 years old. She worked as a rideshare driver, spending most evenings navigating the city and suburbs. Friends described her as someone who believed rules were suggestions for other people. Earlier that evening, she had approached the station attendant, demanding to know why the delay wasn't being fixed faster. When told that mechanical issues required time to resolve safely, Rhea had gestured dismissively and muttered about incompetent transit workers. That night, she had parked near the station to pick up a fare. The passenger had texted that they were waiting on the opposite platform. Rhea stood near the edge of the southbound platform, looking across the tracks. The overpass would require walking the length of the platform, climbing stairs, crossing, and descending on the other side. She checked her phone. The fare was waiting. The announcement system repeated its warning. An inbound train was approaching on the northbound track. Rhea glanced toward the sound, but saw no headlight yet. She stepped off the platform onto the ballast, the loose stones crunching under her shoes. Several passengers noticed her. A woman near the platform edge called out a warning. Rhea looked back and made a dismissive hand gesture. An older man pointed toward the approaching train and shouted more urgently. Rhea shook her head and continued walking, her posture suggesting she found their panic overblown. She crossed the first rail and continued toward the opposite platform. The train's headlight became visible around the curve. The horn sounded, a long, sustained blast. Rhea quickened her pace, but maintained her confident stride, as though the warning was meant for someone else. She reached the far rail and placed one hand on the edge of the northbound platform. The train was traveling at a speed estimated between 40 and 50 miles per hour. Rhea attempted to pull herself up. Her foot slipped on the loose ballast. She lost her grip. The corner of the train's cab and pilot struck her along the right shoulder and upper torso. The impact deflected her body violently sideways, imparting rotational force that sent her tumbling. Multiple ribs fractured. Her clavicle was shattered. She was thrown clear of the tracks, her body striking the ballast and rolling several feet before coming to rest. The train's emergency brakes engaged. Passengers on both platforms began shouting. Several dialed emergency services. Two men climbed down and approached Rhea's body. She was lying on her side, motionless. Blood pooled beneath her. Her eyes were closed. No breathing was visible. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes. Paramedics confirmed massive blunt force trauma. The injuries were unsurvivable. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The train operator provided a statement to transit police, confirming the horn had been sounded and emergency braking initiated immediately. Investigators reviewed footage from station cameras and passenger videos. The recording showed Rhea dismissing multiple warnings before stepping onto the tracks, despite the audible warning and visible train approach. The county medical examiner listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries sustained in a train strike. The death was ruled accidental due to trespassing on active rail property. Service resumed approximately 3 hours later.
It was October 12, 2019, at a restricted spillway area in California. The sky was overcast and flat, casting even light across the concrete structure and the water below. Lyrian Dawson was 36 years old, a part-time barista in Sonora, and a freelance landscape photographer with a growing social media presence built on Sierra Nevada imagery. In pursuit of more extreme compositions, she increasingly sought locations beyond marked access points. While technically skilled, she had no formal training in structural environments, no safety instruction for restricted infrastructure, and no experience with industrial water control sites. She arrived alone at the spillway and went past clearly posted warnings and fencing, marking the area as restricted due to steep concrete and hazardous water conditions. After slipping through a lowered section of barrier, staff on site told her directly to leave. She acknowledged them but brushed it off, saying she just needed a few photos, and kept going onto the spillway apron while leaving her gear outside the restricted zone.
I'm not sure people even realize how violent that shift is, from sliding on concrete to hitting water. It's a hard impact, not a soft landing.
The spillway itself was a steep concrete chute built for high-speed water release. Even when it wasn't actively flowing, the surface could still have a thin layer of algae and mineral buildup, and the smooth concrete made it extremely slippery. She stayed near the upper section for a few minutes, taking photos, looking down, and slowly edging closer to the slope as she worked, gradually moving toward the point where the flat top dropped into the steep apron. At a late morning moment during her positioning along the spillway edge, her footing failed on the algae-coated surface. Traction failed suddenly, with no usable grip or recovery point available. She slipped onto the steep concrete face and rapidly accelerated downslope under gravity across the 65-foot spillway. Reduced friction on the surface resulted in a rapid, uncontrolled slide. I can tell once she hits that algae-slick concrete, there's basically no way to recover it.
She struck the stilling basin at the base of the spillway at high velocity and immediately entered the turbulent outflow water.
The impact forces from the descent and collision collision were catastrophic, producing severe blunt force trauma to multiple regions of the body before submersion. The camera, still attached by a neck strap, was torn free during the fall and recovered outside the spillway zone. Witnesses downstream reported a brief cry followed by silence. Emergency services were alerted after her equipment was found outside the restricted perimeter and no one was visible at the spillway crest. Rescue teams later recovered her body after it was carried beyond the immediate basin into downstream flow. I always find it unsettling how fast she was here turns into she's gone in reports like this. A forensic examination found fatal blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed impact on reinforced concrete, including severe chest and head injuries with multiple fractures and catastrophic internal trauma. Water in the lungs indicated she was alive upon entry into the basin, though the injuries were immediately non-survivable. Her camera contained a sequence of images leading up to the fall, ending with a downward shot along the spillway. Her social media account remained active for months afterward, and her photography circulated online, detached from the circumstances of her death. Her equipment was later donated to a school photography program without disclosure of its origin. It was August 19, 2015, in the Vatnajökull region, Iceland. A marked tourist track ran along a glacier edge where summer thaw had already weakened surface stability, despite calm weather and clear visibility. Hannah Collins, 41, was an independent visitor relying on GPS navigation and downloaded maps rather than a guide. She was physically active and confident in outdoor environments, but she tended to dismiss warning systems when they conflicted with her planned schedule, often treating official route restrictions as overly conservative rather than necessary safety measures. Glacier terrain in the region changes daily as meltwater erodes internal ice structures, forming hidden voids beneath what appears to be stable snow. Warning signs clearly advised staying on marked routes, but she used it to justify leaving the marked route for a shorter crossing across an open ice field, despite clear signage advising against off-route travel. Despite visible signage and direct warnings from a distant guide team, she chose to proceed, arguing the marked route was unnecessarily indirect. She left the official path and moved onto the open ice field. At first, the surface appeared firm, but subtle changes began underfoot, snow compressing into quieter, denser ice. Small fractures forming, but they didn't automatically spread. She slowed briefly, acknowledged the surface change, then moved on anyway. Something I would read as a moment where most people would stop, but she continued past it. As she moved forward, she stepped into a wider, slightly sunken area, later identified as a collapsed melt pocket. The ice here was thinner than the surrounding surface, kinda just a weak crust over a hollow channel underneath. A faint cracking sound started under her steps, spreading out in uneven patterns. Within seconds, the surface gave way beneath her. The ice failed along weakened fracture lines, breaking into irregular slabs as the thin surface layer collapsed into a concealed melt channel filled with icy water and broken ice fragments. The failure propagated locally across adjacent unsupported sections as weight shifted onto structurally compromised ice. She attempted to brace against the edges, but the ice kept breaking under pressure. The collapse expanded outward as structural stress redistributed across weakened ice, causing adjacent unsupported sections to fracture and fail in sequence. Subsurface melt channels contributed to instability by reducing structural integrity beneath the surface layer. A lot of it moves faster than people expect up close. Not a clean single break, but in those uneven failures that keep spreading while you're still trying to react to the first one. A nearby guide team saw the collapse from a distance and immediately radioed emergency services while heading toward the site across unstable terrain. But the fractured ice field kept spreading in unpredictable ways, so they had to move slowly and carefully. Rescue responders arrived following a delayed overland response, reaching the collapse zone within tens of minutes due to the proximity of guide teams and coordinated glacier rescue units already operating in the region. Recovery efforts found her in a submerged channel beneath fractured slabs, where exposure to freezing water and sustained injury had already led to fatal hypothermia and trauma. Death resulted from a combination of traumatic injury sustained during the ice collapse and rapid cold water immersion, leading to immediate cold shock, respiratory failure, and drowning in the submerged channel. The official investigation found no external mechanical trigger and confirmed that the glacier failure was consistent with known subsurface melt void behavior. Contributing factors included deliberate deviation from marked routes and disregard of posted hazard signage and guide warnings, despite repeated indications of unsafe surface conditions leading to misjudgment of surface stability. The shortcut area was permanently closed after surveys revealed extensive hidden melt cavities beneath terrain that had appeared stable from above. I thought the surface would hold long enough to turn back when I needed to. It was November 3rd, 2015, and a cold wind pushed low clouds across the eastern face of a mountain range in Argentine Patagonia, where a gravel parking lot at a trailhead sat mostly empty except for a park ranger's vehicle and a dusty silver SUV with Mendoza plates. Valentina Arriaga was 47 years old and worked as a civil engineer in Mendoza, Argentina. She was super fit and precise, kinda treated hiking the same way she treated her engineering work. Everything planned down to the detail and zero patience for anything that went off script. Her husband later said she had called the park office the day before to confirm the trail was open. They drove 5 hours specifically for this route and booked a hotel nearby. When they arrived at the trailhead and a ranger told them the trail was closed due to recent landslide activity, Valentina pulled out her phone and called the park's regional office from the parking lot while the ranger stood right there watching her do it. The call didn't change anything, but she stayed on it for almost 15 minutes trying to get someone higher up. Her husband said she was convinced the closure was basically a formality and that the trail itself was fine because she had researched conditions online the week before. I've been going back and forth on this one because on paper, she did everything right. She called ahead, drove 5 hours, had the whole thing planned out, and then reality didn't match and she just couldn't let it go. The ranger reiterated the closure and returned to his vehicle. Valentina and her husband continued past the barrier on foot. Her husband later said she was walking well ahead of him on the closed section, moving quickly with her phone out, checking a trail map she had downloaded before the trip. He said he called to her twice to slow down, but she didn't respond. The terrain around them showed pretty obvious signs of recent slide activity on both sides, like loose soil piled along the edges, displaced rocks sitting in the middle of the path, and broken timber all over the slope above. In a few places, the trail had partially washed out, leaving narrow sections where the footing was genuinely unstable. Roughly 40 minutes past the closure point, a saturated section of the slope above the trail gave way. The slide was not massive, but it was fast, carrying rock, loose mud, and broken timber across a span of roughly 30 feet of trail. The sound came first, her husband later said, a low cracking and then a rushing noise from the slope above that built-in volume, faster than he could process what it meant. Valentina was mid-stride when the leading edge of the debris reached her. She was swept roughly 15 feet downslope and partially buried under loose rock, soil, and a section of fallen timber. Her husband, roughly 60 feet behind, got knocked sideways by the outer edge of the slide, but somehow stayed above the surface. He crawled to where she was partially visible and basically just started trying to clear debris from around her head and chest with his bare hands. He called emergency services, but the signal was weak and the call dropped twice before it went through. Rescue teams reached the site on foot roughly 90 minutes later. She was extracted but had sustained catastrophic crush injuries to her torso and pelvis, and the weight of the debris on her chest had prevented her from breathing. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her husband was 60 feet behind her when it happened, and he cooperated with everything after, and I keep thinking about what that drive home alone must have been like for him. The trail remained closed for several additional months while stabilization work was completed. The park authority referenced the incident in updated closure enforcement policies and added physical gate barriers at high-risk trailheads. Her husband cooperated fully with the investigation. No legal action was filed.
It was September 11th, 2015, a Saturday night at a large banquet hall outside Charlotte. The ballroom could hold more than 200 guests and was known locally for elaborate receptions with oversized floral arrangements and dramatic tiered cakes. Patricia Bennett was 67 and had spent nearly 3 decades as an elementary school administrator before retiring. Within her family, she controlled everything: holidays, birthdays, seating, menus, venues. Decisions were expected to go through her first. Most relatives had learned that disagreeing with her meant arguments that lasted weeks. Her relationship with her future daughter-in-law had been deteriorating for over a year. Patricia expected the same compliance she received from her other daughters-in-law. This one refused. During a family dinner that spring, Patricia openly criticized the bride's appearance and accused her of isolating the groom from his family. The bride responded directly in front of everyone instead of staying quiet. The room went silent. Patricia never let go of that night. The catering became its own war. Patricia wanted a company she had used for years at church banquets. The bride chose a friend who had recently opened a small catering business and offered to provide much of the food at a sharply reduced cost. The arrangement saved thousands of dollars. Patricia considered it an insult, spent months complaining privately that the bride had made the wedding look cheap, and by the week of the ceremony was saying it openly in front of relatives. It was her son's wedding. The bride was trying to save them money. Patricia spent months making it about herself. Less than a year before the wedding, Patricia had suffered a serious stroke. Recovery was difficult. She lost strength on her left side and spent months relearning balance and coordination. By September, she could walk independently, but relatives noticed she became physically unstable when upset or overtired. Her blood pressure remained hard to control, despite medication. The reception was tense from the beginning. Patricia spent much of the evening seated near the center tables, criticizing the food, the presentation, and the decision to let the bride's friend handle an event of that size. The groom tried several times to redirect the conversation. She kept returning to it. Around 9:40, staff began preparing for the cake cutting. Guests gathered near the dance floor holding phones and drinks while the music lowered for announcements. Several guests had already complimented the food and congratulated the caterer personally near the cake table, which Patricia had been watching from her seat. She stood up almost immediately after the remarks began. What followed was loud and difficult to contain. She interrupted and began arguing openly near the cake table, directing most of it at the bride. Relatives moved toward the center of the ballroom as voices rose. The bride eventually responded after Patricia insulted her and her friend directly in front of the room. Patricia stepped toward the cake table, still arguing. She lashed out with her foot and struck the lower edge hard enough to shift it sideways. The tiered cake tilted, collapsed, and crashed onto the ballroom floor. The movement threw her off balance. Her foot slipped as she stepped backward, and she fell heavily beside the collapsed stand. At first, guests assumed she had simply lost her footing. Within seconds, it became clear something else was wrong. Patricia struggled to speak. One side of her face drooped noticeably. She stopped responding to the people trying to help her. Emergency services were called at approximately 9:52. Paramedics entered through the main lobby while staff cleared the dance floor. Patricia was conscious when first responders arrived, but severely disoriented and unable to communicate. Doctors later determined she had suffered a massive recurrent stroke during the confrontation. The intense emotional stress and sudden physical exertion had likely caused a severe spike in blood pressure given her recent history. She did not survive. The reception never resumed. Guests left in near silence. The wedding that had taken months of conflict to arrive at was over before the cake had even been cut.
It was July 11th, 2018. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass facade of the luxury high-rise in downtown Miami as Barbara Flint stood on her 42nd floor balcony, surveying the streaked windows that had been bothering her for months. Barbara had built her reputation as the building's most notorious holdout, a retired insurance adjuster who had purchased her corner unit in 2009. She viewed any shared expense as an assault on individual property rights. Previous colleagues said that her background in claims investigation had made her naturally suspicious of contractors and service providers, leading her to challenge every building expense from elevator maintenance to landscaping. High-rise window cleaning demands specialized training and equipment to manage extreme winds and height risks. Professional crews rely on industrial harnesses, redundant safety systems, and weather monitoring. Despite repeated warnings from the building management about safety and insurance liability, Barbara dismissed them as corporate fear-mongering to justify costly service contracts. That morning, Barbara set up a self-devised safety system using second-hand climbing gear she had bought online 5 years earlier, including a harness, carabiners, and static rope stored in a humid unit without proper inspection. Despite high wind advisories for Miami, with gusts up to 35 miles per hour by midday, she was determined to finish before the building's cleaning crew arrived. Barbara planned to anchor herself to the balcony railing and lean outward with an extended squeegee, mistakenly treating the railing as a load-rated anchor. Security footage showed her testing the rope and carabiners, but she likely lacked understanding of fall forces or equipment inspection. Despite her inexperience, she proceeded confidently, while preparing her cleaning supplies. Barbara stepped over the balcony railing and began cleaning the first window panel. The building's security cameras captured her preparation and movements from angles covering the balcony and immediate exterior, though much of her lateral motion across the building was only partially visible as she worked her way across the building's exterior. Her movements became tentatively more confident with each window, though unsteady compared with a trained professional. The wind had been steadily increasing throughout the morning, creating additional stress on her improvised anchor system that she failed to recognize or account for. As Barbara leaned outward to reach a particularly stubborn streak on the glass, the primary carabiner connecting her harness to the anchor rope failed catastrophically due to corrosion and improper cross-loading under the combined forces of her body weight and the wind load. Barbara plummeted immediately, her body striking 3 lower balconies before impacting the concrete courtyard after approximately 5 seconds of fall time over 400 feet below. Multiple residents witnessed the fall and immediately called emergency services. The first responders arrived within 8 minutes, but Barbara's injuries were incompatible with life. The building's security director had watched the entire incident unfold on the monitoring system and provided detailed footage to investigators, but wasn't released publicly. The courtyard area was immediately cordoned off as emergency crews worked to secure the scene. The medical examiner determined that Barbara died from massive blunt force trauma, including multiple skull fractures, complete spinal cord transection, and catastrophic internal organ damage. The impact had been instantaneous and unsurvivable. The building's management company implemented mandatory safety compliance inspections following Barbara's death, prohibiting residents from performing exterior maintenance work. Her estate was subsequently billed for 3 years of unpaid maintenance fees, which were deducted from the proceeds of her unit sale to cover the building's legal and cleanup costs. July 9th, 2016. The public boat ramp on the western shore of a recreational lake in southern Missouri was packed by late morning. The concrete incline descended at a moderate grade into murky water that smelled faintly of algae and gasoline. Temperatures had climbed into the low 90s. Humidity made the air feel heavier. Vehicles towing boat trailers formed a slow-moving line that stretched back into the gravel parking area. Engines idled, radios played through open windows. Families unloaded coolers and life jackets while waiting for their turn. The ramp itself was slick in places from water and moss. Tara King was 38 years old. She worked part-time as an assistant in a small real estate office, handling paperwork and scheduling showings. Friends described her as outspoken and quick to react when she felt slighted. She had driven to the lake that morning with her teenage son to launch a borrowed fishing boat. The wait had stretched past 20 minutes. Tara grew visibly frustrated. Her SUV was third in line. A pickup truck with a large aluminum boat trailer sat directly ahead. The driver had stalled twice while attempting to back down the ramp. Tara put her vehicle in park and stepped out. Her phone remained mounted on the dashboard, live streaming to a social media account she used occasionally. The camera captured the interior of the SUV and part of the ramp through the windshield. She walked forward, moving between her vehicle and the pickup. Other drivers watched from their cars. The concrete was wet and uneven. Tara approached the driver's side of the pickup, gesturing with one hand. Her voice carried over the ambient noise, but words were indistinct. The pickup driver, attempting to reposition the trailer, released the brake. The vehicle began rolling backward down the incline. The trailer followed. Tara was standing slightly to the left of the truck bed, near the rear axle of the trailer. She turned as the trailer moved. The hitch assembly struck her at knee height. The impact knocked her sideways onto the wet concrete. She fell onto her back. The trailer continued rolling. One trailer tire passed over her upper right thigh. The combined weight, roughly 1,800 pounds, crushed the leg against the concrete. The femur fractured under compression. Bone fragments tore through the femoral artery and surrounding vessels. Blood began pooling beneath her as a rapidly expanding hematoma formed in the thigh. External bleeding followed. The trailer rolled another foot before the driver reapplied the brake. Tara did not move. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Bystanders began shouting. Two men ran toward her. One attempted to apply pressure using a towel from his vehicle. The bleeding was difficult to control. Tara's eyes closed. She lost consciousness within roughly 30 to 60 seconds. Someone dialed emergency services. The call was logged shortly before noon. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. They found Tara unresponsive with no detectable pulse. Resuscitation efforts were initiated, but the extent of blood loss made recovery impossible. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The live stream on her phone continued recording audio and the aftermath until a bystander reached into the SUV and ended the broadcast. Investigators reviewed the footage and interviewed witnesses and was immediately removed from the internet due to high graphic imagery. The pickup driver stated he had not seen her approach and had been focused on aligning the trailer. No evidence of intentional action was found. The county medical examiner determined the cause of death to be traumatic femoral artery rupture with rapid exsanguination secondary to crush injury and femoral fracture. The death was ruled accidental. No charges were filed. The ramp reopened later that afternoon.
It was June 19th, 2020, on a desert hiking trail in Arizona. The desert air was already shimmering under extreme midday heat, with exposed rock radiating stored warmth back into an atmosphere that offered almost no relief. Simone Blythe was 38 years old, a freelance bookkeeper working remotely across the Phoenix area. Recently relocated from Portland, she had limited experience with desert hiking in peak summer conditions, having only completed the trail twice during cooler months. Friends described her as independent and determined, and she'd been trying to re-establish a sense of autonomy after a long relationship ended.
Despite understanding Arizona's summer risks, she believed that she could manage a short afternoon hike with minimal supplies, and that belief is something to watch out for what she'll do next.
She arrived alone with a single bottle of water, light clothing, and no gear beyond sunscreen. An extreme heat advisory was active, with temperatures already exceeding safe limits for sustained exertion. At the trailhead, a park ranger explicitly warned her that conditions were dangerous, her water was insufficient, and a midday hike could quickly become life-threatening. At that point, she's already describing her own failure point before she even moves. Simone acknowledged the warning but brushed it off, insisting she would be fine on a short hike. When the ranger offered extra water and suggested she wait for cooler conditions, she refused and maintained that she understood her own limits. He warned her a second time, but she doubled down, insisting she'd hiked in similar heat before and that people tended to overreact to Arizona conditions. Even after one last attempt to stop her, she still went ahead and started down the trail alone. The trail was fully exposed, with sustained elevation gain and no meaningful shade, as heat radiated from the rock surface under direct sun. Within the first hour, her water supply became critically low, and continued exertion in extreme heat accelerated fluid loss and rising thermal strain, with early cognitive effects beginning to emerge.
Around an hour and a half into the hike, she finished her water, but continued forward despite worsening physiological strain.
Her core temperature rose as thermoregulation failed, and sweating became increasingly ineffective and inconsistent, marking heat stroke onset. She became disoriented, but did not turn back, continuing along the exposed ridgeline rather than towards safety. A brief emergency call attempt failed due to poor signal, and no follow-up was made. This is usually where it's not just the heat, it's running out of water that really pushes things over the edge. She eventually collapsed on the trail, dropping onto the sun-heated rock and losing consciousness within moments. A passing hiker came across her unresponsive, her skin extremely hot and dry signs consistent with severe heat stroke. Emergency services were called right away, and cooling efforts started on scene before continuing during transport. Despite aggressive medical intervention, her condition progressed to multi-organ failure due to extreme hyperthermia. She developed multi-organ failure, including kidney and liver injury, driven by systemic inflammation, cellular breakdown, and coagulation dysfunction. She briefly regained consciousness before deteriorating again and dying approximately 2 days after the initial collapse. The medical determination listed exertional heat stroke as the cause of death, with environmental exposure and insufficient hydration as primary contributing factors. Officials noted that survival in such conditions depends on rapid cooling and early recognition of cognitive decline, both of which were delayed by distance and timing. Her encounter with the ranger was later reviewed in updated park procedures for extreme heat advisories, reinforcing stricter warning protocols and support measures for hikers entering entering during high-temperature conditions. The incident contributed to a broader review of heat advisory procedures and updated hydration and warning protocols for extreme conditions. And what I keep coming back to is how early this could have ended, right at the trailhead, not out here on the ridge. It was January 7th, 2017, and the late morning sun was already pushing temperatures into the low 90s along a popular stretch of urban beach in a coastal city in northeastern Brazil, where red warning flags snapped in the onshore wind at intervals along the sand, and a lifeguard station sat on an elevated wooden platform near the main access point. Iracema Cavalcanti was 54 years old and had spent her entire career as a school administrator in the same coastal city, retiring 2 years earlier after nearly 3 decades in the public education system. Since retirement, she had basically built her whole morning routine around the beach. Same spot every day, same towel placement, same umbrella angle, same time of arrival. Her daughter later said Iracema referred to the beach as hers, and she genuinely wasn't joking when she said it. She acted like the stretch of sand in front of her umbrella was basically her personal property. She was known for arguing over seating at nearby cafes and had once spent 10 minutes at a breakfast counter insisting a family move so she could have the table she considered hers. That's kind of the thing with people like this, right? They don't back down because nobody ever makes them back down. And after enough years of getting their way, I genuinely think they just stop believing the rules apply to them. That morning, Iracema arrived at her usual time and found red flags posted along the beach with conditions marked as dangerous. A lifeguard, a man in his early 20s who had been working the station for about 2 years, approached her near the waterline and warned her not to enter the water due to strong rip currents. Iracema told him she had been swimming at this beach since before he was born, basically said the flags were for tourists who didn't know the water. The lifeguard repeated the warning and asked her to stay on the sand. She just waved him off and walked into the surf without looking back. She waded past knee depth, then waist depth, moving with the kind of confidence that kinda only comes from doing something 1,000 times without anything going wrong. The lifeguard watched from the shoreline, whistle in hand. Another beachgoer who saw the whole thing said she literally didn't even glance back at him. Within roughly 2 minutes of entering the water, a rip current caught her at chest depth and began pulling her past the break line. She went from standing to struggling in seconds. Her arms came up, but her body was already moving sideways and out. The lifeguard entered the water immediately, sprinting from the sand into the surf. By the time he reached the area where she had been standing, she was already roughly 40 feet offshore. He swam toward her, but the current pushed him off her line. A second lifeguard launched a rescue board from the station and paddled out. They reached her roughly 6 minutes after she entered the water. She was face down and unresponsive. They pulled her onto the board and brought her back to shore. CPR was started on the beach by the lifeguard team. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. Resuscitation continued for over 30 minutes. She was pronounced dead on the beach. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be drowning, with the rip current documented as the direct mechanism. The lifeguard did everything right here, warned her, went in after her, put his own safety on the line for someone who had just dismissed him to his face, and it still wasn't enough. And honestly, I keep wondering how he moves past that. The lifeguard was cleared in the investigation. The beach authority expanded signage along that stretch and added a second staffed station for high-risk conditions. Iracema's daughter gave a brief statement to local media where she pretty much described her mother as someone who just never believed anything bad could happen to her at her own beach.
It was September 22nd, 2019. A luxury waterfront estate outside Charleston, South Carolina. The pavilion overlooked the harbor, and at the center of it all hung an enormous suspended floral installation directly above the dance floor. Jade Marlowe was 39 years old and was one of the best-known luxury wedding stylists in the region. She was also one of the most difficult people anyone who worked with her had ever encountered. She constantly boasted that she understood high-end aesthetics better than venue management ever could, and argued with contractors, photographers, and safety staff whenever they questioned her decisions. Her reputation for extravagant designs came with an equally well-known reputation for being impossible to work with. During setup the day before the wedding, venue engineers and rigging contractors warned her that the suspended structure exceeded the recommended weight limit for the pavilion's mounting points. They advised installing additional steel support cables and leaving visible stabilization braces in place before guests arrived. Jade dismissed the warnings without much consideration. She insisted she had built similar installations at multiple venues without any problems, and told the engineers they were being overly cautious because they did not understand event design. I've seen entitlement in these cases, but standing under a structure you refuse to secure and arguing about lighting is something else entirely. When safety cables appeared in test photographs, she became furious. She complained the hardware destroyed the illusion and ordered assistance to remove several secondary stabilization supports, despite repeated objections from the rigging crew. Workers later described her moving through the venue in an aggressive and controlling mood, standing over people, criticizing small details, and demanding last-minute changes, while ignoring the mounting concerns overhead. Anyone who hesitated or questioned her judgment was mocked in front of the rest of the crew. By evening, nearly 200 guests filled the pavilion beneath the structure. Several staff members noticed faint metallic creaking sounds coming from overhead during the night. Most assumed it was lighting equipment, shifting in the coastal wind. Around 9:40 p.m., Jade began arguing with venue staff about repositioning the overhead lighting to improve how the canopy looked in photographs. Witnesses later recalled her standing directly beneath the center of the structure while pointing angrily toward lighting technicians above her. One of the primary mounting connections failed seconds later. Witnesses said the suspended structure shifted suddenly to one side before the remaining supports gave way in rapid succession. Heavy metal framing, chandeliers, lighting equipment, and dense floral sections crashed onto the dance floor below. Guests fled through falling debris, shattered glass, and collapsing metal supports. Emergency services were called immediately. Firefighters, paramedics, and rescue crews arrived within minutes and forced their way through the wreckage, while injured guests were treated outside for fractures, cuts, and crush injuries. Jade had been standing at the center of the collapse. Rescue crews spent nearly 20 minutes cutting through sections of collapsed metal framing to reach her. She was found unresponsive beneath the debris and was later pronounced dead at the scene from unsurvivable crush injuries. The collapse was later linked directly to the removed safety supports. The venue permanently banned oversized suspended decorative installations afterward.
It was November 22, 2017. The dusty roads of Córdoba province in Argentina stretched endlessly under the Argentine sun, their isolation hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Marie Kowalski, 42, had relocated from Minneapolis 6 months earlier, seeking a fresh start after a series of road rage incidents had cost her employment at a regional insurance firm. Her Minnesota driving record showed multiple citations for aggressive driving and a restraining order from a driver she had pursued home on 2 separate occasions. Her relatives recalled she viewed confrontations behind the wheel as tests of principle, rarely considering the risk of escalation. Her move to Argentina had not changed her fundamental approach to driving conflicts. Local residents and neighbors noted several tense encounters she'd had in the preceding months, with minor horn-honking disputes and gestures that never escalated into physical violence but drew wary stares. Language barriers had prevented full escalation, leaving Marie frustrated and increasingly insistent that others understand her position. On the day of the incident, Marie believed a motorcyclist had cut her off at a rural intersection outside the city. The perceived slight triggered her familiar pattern of pursuit, following the rider for approximately 12 miles through increasingly remote countryside. Her dashboard camera captured her voice, growing more agitated as she narrated her grievances, convinced the motorcyclist needed to be confronted about his dangerous driving. The motorcyclist, unaware of Marie's intentions, said that he simply continued toward his home along the isolated dirt road. When he turned into his property's long driveway, Marie followed without hesitation. Her dash cam recorded her parking behind his motorcycle, effectively blocking his exit route. She immediately exited her vehicle and began walking toward him, shouting in broken Spanish about his driving, mispronouncing words, and mixing English phrases in a way investigators later said likely worsened confusion and made her intent harder to interpret. The homeowner retreated toward his garage, repeatedly gesturing for Marie to leave his property. Marie ignored his warnings, continuing to advance while pointing accusingly and raising her voice. Her fragmented Spanish and failure to respond to his shouted commands appeared to be interpreted as refusal rather than misunderstanding, increasing his visible agitation. The dashboard camera captured her stepping closer despite his obvious distress and defensive posture, though the camera's fixed forward angle limited clear visibility once she moved fully out of frame. As Marie moved to within a few feet, the motorcyclist drew a legally registered handgun possessed under a valid provincial firearms authorization, again ordering her to stop. Investigators later noted that he remained positioned near the garage entrance with limited retreat options. The camera recorded Marie shouting defiantly and taking another step forward just before a single gunshot echoed across the property. She collapsed immediately beside her vehicle. The homeowner placed an emergency call shortly after the shooting, but the nearest hospital was approximately 45 minutes away. Paramedics arrived roughly 53 minutes after the shooting, finding Marie had already succumbed to her injuries. The dashboard camera provided a continuous visual and audio record of the pursuit and confrontation. Though not every movement was fully visible, the autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the chest, causing massive internal bleeding and lung collapse. Death occurred within minutes from blood loss and respiratory failure, with injuries determined to be rapidly fatal. Provincial authorities reviewed the dashboard footage, witness statements, and ballistic evidence and conducted a formal prosecutorial review before ruling the shooting justified self-defense under Argentine law weeks later. Marie's body was repatriated to Minnesota, where a small funeral service was held for family members.
It was May 14th, 2022, at a mid-sized retail store inside a shopping complex in suburban California. The store was operating under normal customer traffic, with staff rotating between floor assistance, inventory checks, and backroom restocking duties. Joan Revelle was a 60-year-old woman who had just gone to the store looking for one of those household storage items they had on sale. She lived nearby, just in a residential area not far from there. People who knew her later kind of described her as someone who didn't really like waiting around, especially in stores. If something wasn't available right away, she'd get impatient pretty quickly. She didn't have any background in how retail or stockrooms actually work, but she usually trusted her own judgment more than whatever staff were telling her. And that detail alone already shows where the tension starts building. On that day, Joan approached a sales associate asking for a specific item. The employee checked the inventory system and explained it was no longer on the sales floor and would only be available after a scheduled restock. She was offered alternatives and given standard restock information, but she rejected the explanation and kept insisting staff to check inventory, despite being told that it had already been verified.
As the exchange went on, her frustration grew. She raised her voice, drawing attention from nearby customers.
And when the employee stepped away briefly to consult a supervisor, Joan moved toward a staff-only door leading into the stockroom. With the area momentarily unattended amid floor activity, she pushed through before anyone could stop her. Inside the stockroom, it was tight and kind of chaotic narrow aisles. Pallets stacked up, cartons still being staged, shrink-wrapped goods everywhere, and staff actually working with equipment moving around. I've seen enough of these spaces to know they're not built for hesitation or wandering around. Joan kept moving deeper into the stockroom, calling out as she scanned the shelves for the item. While passing through a staging area, she leaned against a pallet that had not yet been fully secured during active restocking. The contact seemed minor, but it shifted the load enough to destabilize part of the stack. Several cartons fell first, followed by a larger shift as the pallet tilted into adjacent inventory. The instability spread through the storage section, causing part of a shelving bay and multiple palletized loads to collapse into the narrow aisle. Joan was struck by the falling inventory and trapped beneath a large volume of merchandise and palletized goods. The collapse left her pinned with severe crushing injuries and unable to free herself. Employees responded immediately after hearing the collapse and called emergency services, but the fallen inventory had created a large entrapment zone while surrounding pallets remained unstable. The weight of the collapsed loads and the confined stockroom layout complicated rescue efforts, requiring responders to secure the area before reaching her. With unstable inventory around the collapse zone, I could see staff could only secure the area and wait for responders.
After access was gained, Joanne was pronounced deceased at the scene due to catastrophic crushing injuries sustained during the collapse.
The investigation determined that Joan's unauthorized entry into the restricted stockroom and disturbance of staged inventory led to the collapse. No charges were filed against the store, and the incident was classified as a preventable accident caused by entering a restricted operational area.